I want to begin by saying a few words directly to racialized Canadians who face discrimination every single day in their lives, even in a country like Canada. What I did hurt them, hurt people who shouldn't have to face intolerance and discrimination because of their identity.
Trudeau's Blackface focuses the attention on one individual, and it suppresses conversations around structural issues, and it asks us to either be aggrieved or be generous enough to forgive this one individual. It doesn't take into account that there is a long history of racism, and it does not take into account the daily racism faced by Indigenous populations, brown populations and black populations in Canada. And it actually helps to consolidate Canada's notion and Canadians' notion of themselves as multicultural.
On October 8, 1971, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau announced Canada was a diverse country that would celebrate and embrace different cultures and ethnic groups. He did this by introducing what was known as the Canadian Multiculturalism Policy. And on July 21, 1988, that policy became the Canadian Multiculturalism Act. This was supposed to be seen as a defining moment of how Canada would begin branding itself as a multicultural icon. But did that defining moment actually live up to its promise to racialized Canadians?
So Canada began branding itself as a multicultural country in response to both what was happening in the domestic level but also internationally. So in the domestic context, in the 1960s, what you have is what is known as the Quiet Revolution in Quebec.
By 1960, when Jean Lesage, the Liberal Party leader then, who comes to power in Quebec, actually with him begins the Quiet Revolution. So his government and the society generally had also come to a point where they wanted to challenge the role of religion in society. So they talked about promoting secular values, they talked about expanding education, embracing modernity, and so on. But at the same time, they also felt that Quebec was a second-class participant in Canadian society. And that's really what the Quiet Revolution was about. So the Quiet Revolution was about the shift and the change that happened.
During the Quiet Revolution, specifically in 1963, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism was created under Canadian Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. The commission was a response to French Canadians in Quebec wanting the language to be seen and treated as equal to the English language, especially in government institutions. In 1968, Pierre Trudeau succeeded Lester Pearson as Prime Minister.
By 1969, when the Prime Minister Trudeau was elected, that is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he was quite opposed to the idea of Quebec nationalism. And he, at the same time, he was not in favor of this commission. So the first thing he did was to dissolve the commission and then talk about multiculturalism as one of the ways for Canada to move forward.
However, Trudeau and his government did accept one of the recommendations from the commission before dissolving it, and that was making both French and English the official languages in Canada. This became a federal statute in 1969 known as the Official Languages Act. But the commission only focusing on English and French as the two core cultures and languages in Canada exasperated an existing problem. Indigenous peoples were being written out of the Canadian core and were categorized as another ethnic group similar to that of immigrants.
So from its very beginning, you have a complete disregard of Indigenous languages and cultures, and other ethnic groups become literally the other.
But it wasn't just domestically that Trudeau was trying to brand Canada as multicultural.
Canada realized that for it to emerge as a global player, it had to distance itself from its white Canada-only immigration policy. There was also need for labor. You have a declining birth rate, so it had to open up its doors. Immigration from Europe was not enough, so the doors were opened up for immigration from developing nations, third world nations. So again, it was not that Canada had suddenly decided that it would be a tolerant, welcoming country and open up its doors, but domestic reasons resulted in that.
Whatever change that has come about in multiculturalism in Canada has largely been based on a struggle. There's a sordid history which is really unpleasant, and I think one needs to examine that. And I think by examining it, we move ahead, because if we acknowledge what the wrongs that have happened in the past, we can try to undo some of the present realities which still discriminate against people, which still racialize people, and so on.
This includes residential schools, the Chinese head tax, Komogato Maru, the internment of Japanese Canadians, the 60 scoop, and even the Yonge Street protest.
Bill 21 is essentially banning members of religious groups from wearing religious symbols in public spaces, essentially, right? And so it's creating almost second-class citizenship. And you would never kind of think that we'd be at this point in 2019 where people are thinking about, do I have to take off my hijab, or, can I be a teacher, or do I have to remove this thing?
I think Bill 21, in my mind, is a complete antithesis of what it means to be inclusive. This is a bill that excludes a large number of people who happen to practice their religion. And the Multiculturalism Act, as well as the Charter, protects that right. That is the freedom to practice your religion, your culture, and language, and so on. And this bill actually opposes all that.
Along with the other major party leaders, Justin Trudeau has decried Bill 21. He has also gone one step further, saying he would be open to federal action against the bill. But Trudeau has had his own racist incidents. He has been defending his role as an ally to racialized communities after videos and pictures of him in brown and blackface emerged throughout the 2019 election campaign.
I think Trudeau's blackface, brownface really kind of unmasked a greater problem that we have in terms of how Canadians see their Canadian identity now and in terms of the global stage. But I think it really opens up a larger conversation around systemic racism, policies and practices that are colonial and continue to disenfranchise certain groups in our country, even now.
So when incidents of racism captures the attention of Canadians and the media, even on a global scale, how do we take the spotlight away from the individual and bring it back to the racial discrimination against people of color? Experts say one way is by naming racism and having open conversations about it.
I think you have to start by recognizing that racism exists. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is kind of this erasure or denial of even kind of recognizing that, hey, you know what, this is actually racist. This is a form of anti-Black racism. This is Islamophobia. So I think we have to start labeling and recognizing discrimination when we see it and call it out.
As a witness, if we witness a microaggression, naming it for that victim is so important, because then it validates, oh, this did happen. That was racism you just experienced. And it helps that person feel included and validated, and it goes such a long way to supporting that person's mental health and well-being. Talking about racism, it's so deeply personal because it's about our identity. And so having these conversations are really taxing. And it's really important to remember that racism is trauma.
I think we've made attempts to be more inclusive. That doesn't mean that that there isn't more work to do. I think we have a ton of work to do.
I think in terms of policies and creating safe spaces for people of color, you can look at it at three levels. Let's start with the public policy level. Things like legislation. The Anti-Racism Act in Ontario, for example, is a great example of us as a society making a commitment to anti-racism. At an institutional level, there's many policies that can be put in place to support racialized individuals. And I'm thinking of things like bias-free hiring policies to ensure that discrimination isn't a factor when someone's hired into an organization, into the labor market. And at an interpersonal level, it's really important to have equity policies in place within an organization, and anti-harassment, anti-discrimination policies, so that it's very clear that when an incident of racism does occur, that there is a very clear process for how you address it.
So, has Canada been able to live up to its multiculturalism promise to racialize Canadians?
This idea of what does it mean to be Canadian, right? And so I think we are kind of going through a little bit of an identity shift in terms of who are we as a nation.
The multiculturalism, although you have the word multiculture there is a hierarchy to begin with. Multiculturalism did not ever mean equality of all the cultures that comprise Canada.